The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 intended to establish peace in Vietnam and an end to the Vietnam War. It ended direct U.S. military combat, and temporarily stopped the fighting between North and South Vietnam. The governments of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the United States, as well as the Provisional Revolutionary Government that represented indigenous South Vietnamese revolutionaries, signed the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam on January 27, 1973. The agreement was not ratified by the United States Senate. The negotiations that led to the accord began in 1968 after various lengthy delays. As a result of the accord, the International Control Commission was replaced by International Commission of Control and Supervision to fulfill the agreement. The main negotiators of the agreement were United States National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Vietnamese Politburo member Lê Đức Thọ. The two men were awarded the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts, although Lê Đức Thọ refused to accept it. Provisions of the Accords. The document began with the statement that the United States and all other countries respect the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam as recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam. The inclusion of this provision was a victory for the Communist side of the negotiations by allowing that the war was not a foreign aggression against South Vietnam. The main military and political provisions of the agreement were, beginning on January 27, 1973 at midnight, Greenwich Mean Time and Saigon time, 8 o'clock on 28 January there would be an in-place ceasefire. North and South Vietnamese forces were to hold their locations. They were permitted to resupply military materials to the extent necessary to replace items consumed in the course of the truce. Once the ceasefire is in effect, U.S. troops would begin to withdraw, with withdrawal to be complete within 60 days. Simultaneously, U.S. prisoners of war would be released and allowed to return home. The parties to the agreement agreed to assist in repatriating the remains of the dead. There would be negotiations between the two South Vietnamese parties Saigon and the Viet Cong towards a political settlement that would allow the South Vietnamese people to decide themselves the political future of South Vietnam through genuinely free and democratic general elections under international supervision. Reunification of Vietnam was to be carried out step by step through peaceful means. Paris Peace Negotiations. Early deadlocks. Following the success of anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy in the New Hampshire primary, in March 1968 U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson halted bombing operations over the northern portion of the North Vietnam, in order to encourage Hanoi to begin negotiations. Shortly thereafter Hanoi agreed to discuss a complete halt of the bombing, and a date was set for representatives of both parties to meet in Paris. The sides first met on May 10, with the delegations headed by Khua Sen Thua, who would remain the official leader of the North Vietnamese delegation throughout the process, and U.S. Ambassador-at-Large W. Avril Harriman. For 5 months the negotiations stalled as North Vietnam demanded that all bombing of North Vietnam be stopped, while the U.S. side demanded that North Vietnam agree to a reciprocal de-escalation in South Vietnam. It was not until October 31 that Johnson agreed to end the airstrikes and serious negotiations could begin. One of the largest hurdles to effective negotiation was the fact that North Vietnam and its ally in South Vietnam, the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, refused to recognize the government of South Vietnam. With equal persistence, the government in Saigon refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the NLF. Harriman resolved this dispute by developing a system by which North Vietnam and U.S. would be the named parties. NLF officials could join the North Vietnam team without being recognized by South Vietnam, while Saigon's representatives joined their U.S. allies. A similar debate concerned the shape of the table to be used at the conference. The North favored a circular table, in which all parties, including NLF representatives, would appear to be equal in importance. The South Vietnamese argued that only a rectangular table was acceptable, for only a rectangle could show two distinct sides to the conflict. Eventually a compromise was reached, in which representatives of the northern and southern governments would sit at a circular table, with members representing all other parties sitting at individual square tables around them. Claimed sabotage of negotiations by Nixon campaign. Bryce Harlow, former Eisenhower White House staff member, claimed to have a double agent working in the White House. I kept Nixon informed. Harlow and Henry Kissinger separately predicted Johnson's bombing halt. Democratic Senator George Smathers informed Johnson, "The word is out that we are making an effort to throw the election to Humphrey. Nixon has been told of it." According to presidential historian Robert Deleck, Kissinger's advice rested not on special knowledge of decision-making at the White House but on an astute analyst's insight into what was happening. William Bundy stated that Kissinger obtained no useful inside information from his trip to Paris, and almost any experienced Hanoi watcher might have come to the same conclusion. While Kissinger may have hinted that his advice was based on contacts with the Paris delegation, this sort of self-promotion is at worst a minor and not uncommon practice, quite different from getting and reporting real secrets. Nixon asked Anna Chennault to be his channel to Mr. Thieu. Chennault agreed and periodically reported to John Mitchell that Thieu had no intention of attending a peace conference. On November 2, Chennault informed the South Vietnamese ambassador, "I have just heard from my boss in Albuquerque who says his boss, Nixon, is going to win. And you tell your boss, Thieu, to hold on a while longer." In response, Johnson ordered the wiretapping of members of the Nixon campaign. Deleck wrote that Nixon's efforts probably made no difference, because Thieu was unwilling to attend the talks and there was little chance of an agreement being reached before the election. However, his use of information provided by Harlow and Kissinger was morally questionable, and Humphrey's decision not to make Nixon's actions public was an uncommon act of political decency. Nixon government. In 1969 Richard Nixon succeeded to the U.S. presidency and replaced Harriman with Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was later replaced by David Bruce. Also that year, the NLF set up a Provisional Revolutionary Government, to gain government status at the talks. However, the primary negotiations that led to the agreement did not occur at the peace conference at all but were carried out during secret negotiations between Kissinger and Le Duc Thieu, which began on August 4, 1969. North Vietnam insisted for 3 years that the agreement could not be concluded unless the United States agreed to remove South Vietnamese President Nguyen Va Phuoc Thieu from power and replace him with someone more acceptable to Hanoi. Nixon and Kissinger were unwilling to overthrow through an agreement a government the NLF had failed to overthrow by force of arms, though the extent of North Vietnamese demands is contested. Marilyn Young contends that the contents of Hanoi's proposal were systematically distorted from their original plea to permit Thieu's replacement, to what Kissinger propagated as a demand for his overthrow. Breakthrough and agreement. The major breakthrough came on October 8, 1972. North Vietnam had been disappointed by the results of its Nguyen Hue offensive, and feared increased isolation if Nixon's efforts at Dark Copyright Tent significantly improved U.S. relations with the chief communist powers, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, who were backing the North Vietnamese military effort. In a meeting with Kissinger, Thieu significantly modified his bargaining line, allowing that the Saigon government could remain in power and that negotiations between the two South Vietnamese parties could develop a final settlement. Within 10 days the secret talks drew up a final draft. Kissinger held a press conference in Washington during which he announced that peace is at hand. When Thieu, who had not even been informed of the secret negotiations, was presented with a draft of the new agreement, he was furious with Kissinger and Nixon and refused to accept it without significant changes. He then made several public radio addresses, claiming that the proposed agreement was worse than it actually was. Hanoi was flabbergasted, believing that it had been duped into a propaganda ploy by Kissinger. On October 26 Radio Hanoi broadcast key details of the draft agreement. However, as U.S. casualties mounted throughout the conflict, American domestic support for the war had deteriorated, and by 1973 there was major pressure on the Nixon administration to withdraw. Consequently, the U.S. brought great diplomatic pressure upon their South Vietnamese ally to sign the peace treaty even if the concessions Thieu wanted could not be achieved. Nixon pledged continued substantial aid to South Vietnam, and given his recent landslide victory in the presidential election, it seemed possible that he would be able to follow through on that pledge. To demonstrate his seriousness to Thio U, Nixon ordered the heavy Operation Linebacker 2 bombings of North Vietnam in December 1972. These operations were also designed to keep North Vietnam at the negotiating table and to prevent it from abandoning negotiations and seeking total victory. With the U.S. committed to disengagement, Thio U had little choice but to accede. On January 15, 1973, Nixon announced a suspension of offensive actions against North Vietnam. Kissinger and Thọ met again on January 23 and signed off on a treaty that was basically identical to the draft of 3 months earlier. The agreement was signed by the leaders of the official delegations on January 27 at the Hotel Majestic in Paris. Aftermath: the Paris Peace Accords had little practical effect on the conflict, and were routinely flouted by both the North Vietnamese and the Saigon government, which enlarged the area under its control in 1973. North Vietnamese military forces gradually built up their military infrastructure in the areas they controlled, and 2 years later were in position to launch the successful offensive that ended South Vietnam's status as an independent country. Nixon had secretly promised Thio U that he would use air power to support the Saigon government should it be necessary. During his confirmation hearings in June 1973, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger was sharply criticized by some senators after he stated that he would recommend resumption of U.S. bombing in North Vietnam if North Vietnam launched a major offensive against South Vietnam. But by August 15, 1973, 95% of American troops and their allies had left Vietnam, both North and South, as well as Cambodia and Laos. However, Nixon was driven from office due to the Watergate scandal in 1974, and when the North Vietnamese began their final offensive early in 1975, the United States Congress refused to appropriate additional military assistance for South Vietnam, citing strong opposition to American involvement in the war by Americans and the loss of American equipment to the North by retreating Southern forces. Thio U subsequently resigned, accusing the U.S. of betrayal in a TV and radio address. At the time of the peace agreement, the United States agreed to replace equipment on a one-by-one basis. But the United States did not keep its word. Is an American's word reliable these days? The United States did not keep its promise to help us fight for freedom, and it was in the same fight that the United States lost 50,000 of its young men. Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese army supported by Viet Cong units on April 30, 1975. Schlesinger had announced early in the morning of April 29 the evacuation from Saigon by helicopter of the last U.S. diplomatic, military, and civilian personnel. Not only did North Vietnam conquer South Vietnam, but the Communists were also victorious in Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh on April 17, as were the Pathet Lao successful in capturing Vientiane on December 2. Like Saigon, U.S. civilian and military personnel were evacuated from Phnom Penh, and the U.S. diplomatic presence in Vientiane was downgraded and the number of U.S. personnel was reduced. Those who stayed behind in Laos supported the Mongs in the post-war insurgency that began on December 3 and would eventually extend their aid to the Royalists in exile and the right-wingers. Signatories: Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., former United States Ambassador to South Vietnam, led the U.S. delegation. William P. Rogers, United States Secretary of State, Tra Section N. Va Florin N. Liem, Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Vietnam, Nguyen Tha Ba Nh, Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam, Nguyen Duy Trinh, Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Other key figures in the negotiations: Henry Kissinger, Lê copyright C. Tharthos CHNHANT HANH. See also. References: The Paris Agreement on Vietnam, 25 years later. Conference transcript, The Nixon Center, Washington, D.C., April 1998. Reproduced on folioc.edu. Access September 5, 2012. The Constitution, Executive Agreements accessed July 29, 2014. A.B. Robert Dallek, Nixon and Kissinger, Partners in Power, HarperCollins, pages 73 to 74. Deadlock, pages 74 to 75. In 1997, Chennault admitted that I was constantly in touch with Nixon and Mitchell. Deadlock, pages 75. Taylor, David. The Lyndon Johnson tapes, Richard Nixon's treason. BBC News Magazine, March 22, 2013. Last retrieved March 22, 2013. Deadlock, pages 77 to 78. Marilyn Young. The Vietnam Wars, 1945–1990, Harper Perennial, pages 263 to 264. Legros, Colonel William E. Vietnam from Ceasefire to Capitulation, U.S. Army Center of Military History, Department of the Army, pages 28, 1975. Vietnam's President Thieu resigns. On this day, April 21, 1975. Further reading, Harrington, Stuart. A Peace with Honor? An American Reports on Vietnam. Presidio Press. Part 2, Life Under the Paris Agreement, pages 16–40. Hershenson, Bruce. An American Amnesia, How the U.S. Congress Forced the Surrenders of South Vietnam and Cambodia. New York, Beaufort Books. ISBN 978-0-8253-0632-7. External links, text of the Paris Peace Accords, Nixon and Vietnam timeline, timeline of NVA invasion of South Vietnam, OELBJ tapes implicate Nixon with treason. ABC News. December 5, 2008, OE The Trials of Henry Kissinger. Documentary by Eugene Jarecki. Sequence on Nixon campaign sabotage of Paris Peace Accords, start 15 minutes 20 seconds end 20 minutes 10 seconds. The short film Vietnam War is available for free download at the Internet Archive, OE Les Accords de Paris, 40 ans plus tard, unfilmed Irina Sherman. Documentary by Rena Sherman.